Good morning, welcome, and thank you for joining us today, live from NGV International in Melbourne. My name is Ewan McKeown, and I'm here to welcome you here for today's panel, which is the beginning of the Triennial Conversations program to mark the opening of the NGV Triennial. And today's panel will be looking at the politics of water in Australia, inspired by JR's artwork in the Triennial homily to country. Before we begin, I'd like to mention that this program is being delivered in partnership with the New York Times, and I'd welcome our audience joining on their live stream. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that we're gathered today on the land of the Wurundjeri and the Bunurong, the peoples of the Kulin Nation, and I'd like to pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. And indeed, for other people joining us from other places, I would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands that they are on, and acknowledge their enduring connection to country. Regretfully, Damien Cave, who was meant to be moderating this morning's event, can't join us. He travelled from New South Wales, and we're following the latest health guidelines today, and so I'm stepping in his place. Thank you, Damien. So today, I'm very lucky to be joined by a panel of guests who have been integrally involved in one of the artworks in the Triennial, and one of the authors from the Triennial publication. So we have Gabrielle Chan, Alan White, Badger Bates, and Rachel Strawn. Now, we're going to start by going to a quick snippet of film from JR's artwork to sort of set the scene and contextualize what we'll be talking about today.
When the river is out there, see that line there?
Yeah,
That's where the river should be.
okay. You think you will ever go back there?
We're going to try and get it back there. They need to help us protect all this for future generations. It's not just for me and my people, even though we got native title over some parts of the country, it's for everyone. We are not irrigators, but we do need the river. And you know, with me, I was saying, JR, to me, I'm a Barker Weenbitcher. That means I'm a Darling River black person. I belong to the river. Without the river, I got nothing. I got no culture. I got nothing. I'm just a wanderer walking up and down on a dry creek bed with nothing. That's the way my people feel.
They call it the water wars already, but it can be fixed. There is solutions out there. It's a matter of enough rain in the Northern Basin, enough keep the pumps out of it. There's a lot of pumps involved up there that take water out.
Yeah.
We hope that sense will prevail with the state governments and those in charge of the water sharing.
Do you think climate change play a big part in it also?
I think it's playing a part.
Yeah.
How big, we're not sure yet.
Yeah.
We've definitely seen new records broken, bad records broken. For this river hasn't been connected to the Murray for 18 months, and that's never in white man, European settlement of Australia. There's 240 years, which never been more than maybe 3 months at a time, 4 months.
I was invited by the NGV to do a project here, and you see my work is pretty simple. I just take photos and then paste them, Okay. So I print them and then paste them in different places to give attention to different situations. Because in France we have our own situation with farmers, in In Italy, they have their own situations, but at the end, it always comes to a common point, which is that farmers cannot survive with what they do, and often monoculture and culture made by giant corporation takes over. And in the day-to-day, for a small consumer like me, who just want to eat nice tomato and look for the best banana, basically, the one thing we are destroying is all the people who were making those with their heart and with their love. And so when I went and visited some farmers in Italy, and they explained me that exact situation, except that there it's not because necessarily of climate change like here. I basically photographed them, printed them very big, and then we buried them with themselves. But before that, we made a procession.
We're trying to avoid that.
I'm looking forward to not being buried for a while.
Exactly. And the idea is that, of course, they're not dead, but the way they've been living and the way that we've known agriculture until today is dying. Suddenly, because of that giant image and that whole procession, people are like, okay, what is the situation there? And so I thought I would bring this project here. I want to photograph you, and like I photographed Alan and Rachel yesterday, just, standing like that, looking straight. And then we'll print that very big, very, very big.
Cool.
Anytime they go and visit those giant, they take a photo and we share it, so it raises attention. But until there's a shocking image that really convey to other people what is going on, well, the younger generation will not really pay attention to it because it's easier to repost a dolphin who's dying on the side of the ocean, image that are shocking, like the image I saw of the fish, a couple hours away from here that are all dead. Unfortunately, it's those kind of images that wakes up people.
The water for the aquifer comes out of this river, goes into the aquifer. So if this river's not here, the aquifer's not refilling. So we can only use so much out of that bore, and then she's going to be dry. And then there's no water. If there's no water in a livestock game, or most games, you're in that hole like that fellow was there. You're dead and buried.
JR doing his work, what I'm doing with my work, it might hit something and say, no, we've got to stop this. Because for the future, for the kids, I don't want to see my grandkids come up and see this.
So, pretty confronting footage. I was there on those days, and to go and visit this site of where you live every day and experience that, and for JR as well. But Gabriel, as an author, journalist who's written extensively about rural Australia, but also water and the environment, can you, Wayne, who we visited as well, mentioned the water wars. For the audience, can you just set the scene, I suppose, at the bigger picture? What are the water wars, and what is actually occurring on the Murray-Darling in the basin?
Well, water has been the subject of wars forever, I think, throughout humanity. But what happened in Australia is, for the colonial period at least, our food industry set up for export, set up to, feed the motherland, if you like. But irrigated agriculture has always been a really pivotal part of that, and a lot of that infrastructure rolled out, throughout history. It was traditionally quite protected. I think with deregulation in the last 30 years, we started to hear conversations from government about opening that up, changing it, and it changed the value of water. It put a really a price on water, I guess, that opened it up to trading through the reforms of the Turnbull era. And I think the complexity of how water is managed between state and federal governments, the removal of public servants from local communities really changed things, I think, significantly. So what we've got now is this really, really polarised debate, I think, in the public space, where there's this kind of disconnection with where we get our food from. I mean, irrigated agriculture really produces, I think it's half the value of our agricultural produce, but it's become a very contested space. So we're seeing in the public realm, irrigator against irrigator in some senses, Indigenous people being left out often of the debate entirely, and no local nuance. And I think the interesting thing about this group of people that we have here, and I've reported up and down the river, is that in this part of the world, in the Darling, it's one of the most unified spaces, I guess, for community people where farmers, irrigators, Indigenous people are all saying the same thing, and that's basically save the river.
Mm. And Rachel, when we came to your place with JR, obviously the river was dry at that time. This was in February this year. How have you seen the river change over the years? Like this drying, when did that begin? And it sort of culminated at that moment. And what were the impacts of that on you as a farmer and your family?
Yeah, so we're on a property on the Darling, just north of Wentworth, and we grew irrigated citrus and wine grapes, and citrus had been grown there since the 1930s. As Wayne said in the film, the river never used to cease to flow for any more than 3 months, yet in this last episode it's been more than 18 months that we had a cease to flow, and the horrendous fish deaths and the state of the river is the worst in European history. So we are being absolutely detrimental to the future of that. It's impacted our farm in that we can no longer grow horticulture because we don't have a reliable water supply. But it's not only that, it's impacted our children. I always say, if you can't bathe your children in it and you can't give it to your stock, the water quality is so horrendous, what is left in the holes and the fish can't live in it, we've really killed the river. And it's a real embarrassment that it's happening on our generation, and it really, really affects a lot of generational farmers along there. And I can't even imagine how people like Badger, being an elder in his community, feel that watching what white man has done to this river, because it's criminal, really. We have a lot of ways that it can be turned around, but it's going to take a strong government to stand up and say, we need a healthy rivers throughout, which the Basin Plan is supposed to do. But I think it's the states that have to come to the party first and really have those protections within the river and ensure that you don't have one winner at the top and the downstream communities just completely missing out, losing their communities and their families. We have to have an economy to be able to live out there, but we can't over-extract that it's not sustaining everyone.
Mm. And Badger, you spoke really eloquently on the film about the role, the place of the river within your culture and your relationship to that and that of your family and community. But you also spoke about a thing which I found quite interesting, this idea of shut-up water. Can you explain what shut-up water is and how, and what's your experience and the experience of your community in trying to advocate for the health of the river over many years?
Yeah, well, first up, before I answer the question, I'd like to point out that I'm 73 years of age, and in my lifetime, I can remember back to, say, when I was about 5-year-old, that's when my memory started to get to understand the barker and that. And so for the last, say, 60, 7 years, or say 60 years, so I'll give and take, it changed a lot. The river did go up and down. It's like Wayne said there in the video, that things do change. We go through climate change and all that. But in my years of living on the Barker, I never ever seen 3 green little puddles like you seen on that video. That is shocking. I might go away from the question a bit, but it's still there. It is shocking. It's not allowed. They say that they got a water sharing plan. You go back to us Aboriginal people, us black people, the Barker is our ngamaka, that means it's our mother. Without that we finish. Also, it's not just us now, it's everyone like Rachel and Ellen, their families and that. It's still there. There is no proper management. The government's got to stop treating us like mushrooms, feeding us a lot of crap, then putting us back in the cupboard and coming and looking for boats. No more. So if that answers your question, Ewan, but if you want me to keep going, I will.
That's great. Let's keep moving and get another perspective. So, Alan, when we were out there with JR, you were literally bulldozing trees that you had grown from seedlings and burning them. Why were you doing that? I mean, you can't water those trees anymore. And what is the future of your farm and your family now? How have you had to change and plan ahead?
Look, there's several answers to that question. The first one, in terms of why did it get to that stage, historically we used to have a reliable supply of water. Now, we had what's known in the New South Wales system as high security licences on a regulated river, and for many, many years that meant that we had water. Now, we didn't have huge volumes of water, we didn't have thousands of megalitres, but we had enough for what we were doing. And it was a reliable supply on a river which itself was reliable. And that changed. So we went from a situation where we had the most secure high security irrigation licences in the Murray-Darling Basin, and they were specified high security, originally for permanent plantings. But we went to the situation where we had the least reliable high security water in the Murray-Darling Basin. And that happened over a period of probably 15, 20 years. And when we first got into some trouble with the river in the early 2000s, 2003 and 4, and we scraped our way through that. I think we're very good at managing farms in difficult conditions, but we got through that, and it was great relief when the water turned up. And we thought, well, that's good, great. We've got through it, we're still here. We'll talk to our grandkids about how we survived the dry years at the start of the 2000s. Then 2006 and 7 it happened again, but it was worse. Went through to 13, 14, it happened again and it was worse. And about then, Rachel, myself, and I think a few others, including even some of the honest people in the New South Wales Water Department, and there were some at the time, came to the conclusion that really at the rate things that were going, there wasn't a future for permanent planting / high security irrigation on the Lower Darling. We came to the conclusion, and indeed we had advice from some of the agency people at the time, that really we better start thinking about what's plan B. And we would have much preferred to have had reliable water supplies as we used to have, and we knew exactly what had to be done to do that. But I think we also knew that we were not going to be able to do that. We had 6 family properties along the Lower Darling with permanent plantings. We can't, on our own, roll the northern irrigation industry. We can't roll the basin plan. So we started thinking about what the options were, and we ended up coming to an arrangement with Canberra to remove all permanent plantings, and you were there when we were in the process of doing that. Now, in our case, we developed that property effectively from nothing over a period of about, 40-something years, and we then pulled it apart. And that's where we got to, and you saw it when, at the end of the clean-up, when we were burning up the trees.
It's tough. So, Gab, is there just not enough water to go around? I mean, what's unclear here a little bit is, is it just less rain, less water moving through the system, or is more being extracted somehow? How does it add up?
So I think there is, in the last couple of decades, well, at least all the government reports have said there has been less rain or more changeable rain periods due to climate change. But the thing about this space that's so contested, and Mick Kelty, the Inspector General of Water, did a report recently that said there's no single point of truth. So it's really hard to get transparency in the system. Different governments do different things. The way the water is managed and administered is different in various places. So it's very hard to get that clear view of what's happening. And each community, has their own experience along the river system. The other thing that's changed is that, Australia really was the first country in the world to set up this kind of water trading system, which was essentially like a free market trading system. And the idea was that water would go to the highest return usage, the best possible usage. Now, in a market system where free information is available, that's fine, but in a very muddy market, pardon the pun, that's really hard. And it's really hard for, say, family farmers who have to trade at the end of the day after a day at work, that you've seen some of their days at work. It's hard to compete with a big corporate farmer that might have a dedicated water desk and all they do is trade the numbers and get right across that system. I think, the Weekly Times, the rural newspaper in Victoria, does a list every year of the top owners in Australian farming, and that is changing rapidly. I mean, the number one owner by value is now a Canadian superannuation fund that owns a lot of water. So in one of some say the driest continent in the world, what are you going to put your money into? Water. So those financial transactions are changing things, and the people are on the ground are left to deal with what's, the effects of that.
So this issue of ownership is very interesting. I mean, Badger, you talked about having native title over parts of the river and as traditional owners of this land. You put forward in an essay for the Triennial publication, I thought, a very optimistic view of a different type of future where the priorities are shifted. So currently the priority at the moment seems to be that the water is seen as a resource that can be bought and sold. You advocate for a situation where the environment is placed at the top of that pyramid. Can you just describe how you think what would be the consequences of that change?
Well, to go back again, because I twisted your question, but to go back again, when you asked about shut up water, I think there what Alan done, he was answering the question, because to me shut up water is environmental water. You seen the bed of the Barker when me and JR walked along? There's nothing there. That mussel I picked up about this big, it takes a long time from a little piece of plankton for that mussel to get that size, right? Also what Alan said was there was management through before this come. Now, again, shut up water is now you see it, now you don't. The picture what is on there is proven that point. The other thing about shut up water is what Alan said, he can't survive anymore, and none of us can survive, and that's where it is. It's got to be managed properly. Then to go and answer the question about native title, what's the good of native title without water? I said that the Barker is our ngamaka. That means that's my mother, right? To what Alan and Rachel are saying, that's their mother too. You can't take us away from the land. We are all, I'm a Barker Weembitcher, that means I'm a Darling River black person, These are Barker people. Doesn't matter what colour they belong to the Barker. And you can't and no one will take us away from that land. So native title is nothing. What's the good of having that jug of water in them 2 glasses when they're empty and we're in a desert? You know, we're not going to carry them around, we're just going to throw them away. We're just using our energy. And I think that's where our energy is going when people come along and walk away from the land. But we won't. My grandson is named after the Barker. He is my young grandson. When I can't talk anymore, he will take over. And I'm pretty sure Rachel and Helen's family will do the same thing. But it's shut up water. We own water. But now what they're doing with the management at the Menindee Lakes, we got Aboriginal occupation, what was there for 45,000 years. We knew the Barker changed courses. We got a thing what they call the Tullywalker Channel. It changed again, and that was the original Barker. The Menindee Lakes and around there, we find lungfish, you know, bone and teeth, and a lot of megafauna. So it's not just Mungo, where they found the oldest cremation in the world. There was Aboriginal people there, my people, on this continent and on this country, and it was managed. Then, to me again, is the sheep and bullock in Western New South Wales. When the explorers came, they brought those animals with them. They survived. They didn't bring a bag full of cotton and throw it. They bought some wheat and some seeds to grow something, is what Rachel and them doing, exactly the same thing. Wayne is a farmer, you know, sheep and bullock he got, but then he depend on the Barker and he look after the kuyu in the Barker, that's mean the fish in the river. So you're getting people what's managing that Barker, and I say it belongs to the lot of us, and we should be protecting it properly.
So Rachel, you advocate as well for this, you know, very sensible approach, which would be if the environment and the health of the river is top priority, it sustains many possibilities.
We have to coexist with it. Without that coexisting, without water, we don't have life. So you can't use more than what it can give. So if it can't provide, and it's up to us to actually make sure that government has policy that protects the basic health of the river as number one, and then that sustains communities and that sustains economies, and we all have a fair share that we can go forward and protect it for our future generations. If we have one person at the top of the system taking it all and forgetting about downstream communities and the downstream needs of all those lakes and the ecology and everything else that is there, you just get this imbalance, and that's what we've seen on the screen. Like 18 months cease to flow, and the fish kills that we witnessed back in 2018-19, we had grown men walking the banks of the river in tears, which it just... You couldn't believe it. The emotion out there of what we have seen, the over-politicking of water and going to the biggest economic interest rather than actually putting the river first, it's absolutely criminal that we've got politicians and bureaucrats and certain leaders within agriculture who are not making this sustainable into the future. And that's where we may have lost the main income of our farms now, but we're not going to give up on this river. Like it's just too crucial, and it links from the north to the south and out through to South Australia. You've got Queensland, New South Wales, Victoria, and South Australia. This isn't just a small area that quite often, until the fish kills, we were ignored because we're not a political voice. We're an area of very few votes, but it's such an insignificant, important area, like Badger's saying, and the history there and what it historically sustained in Indigenous life to then, I'm embarrassed that to be European and placed it in the position that we have. Like, we all need a good kick up the butt and just get on and be a voice for it and speak up for it now and make it our priority.
Well, we probably all should be a bit embarrassed, I think. You recently met the New South Wales Premier at the Menindee Lakes, which Badger was mentioning before the place. But so what did she say to you?
Political rhetoric is fantastic, and she spoke very, very well, and she released tens of thousands of fingerlings back into the Barker, and we're hoping that they will grow and sustain and reproduce. But we also reminded her that at the moment New South Wales policy has nothing in it to actually protect those flows coming down the river. So at the moment, if those protections don't occur, by next Christmas we're going to be facing more fish kills and a dry riverbed. And we've only just had water. It got to our place in Easter this year, April. So to be looking at within an 18-month period back to dry riverbed, it's not acceptable at all.
And Gabrielle, internationally, there are new sort of legal instruments emerging to protect ecologies, such as, for example, the idea of having the fundamental rights of an environment. And then an example in Victoria is the Yarra River Act, the Birrarung Act, which protects the river as a living entity. Do you think that it's practically that kind of legal structure that is going to be necessary to actually shift things to the extent that they need to move? What do you think is the sort of, what would you call for as a kind of, if this is about the politics of water, what does politics need to achieve?
Well, I think politics needs to have another look at the reforms that have been put in place in the last 30 years. There is a trend towards awarding natural systems like rivers their own legal rights, because who else stands up for them? I think there's, and Badger could probably talk to this more, there's a question about the water rights for Indigenous people, a big question there. But I think in political terms, I think the really clever thing that neoliberalism has done is sort of presented this deregulation as the natural system, as if that's just what happens when you take rules away. The thing about water is there's still so many rules involved. There's so many regulations involved in this system. It's not deregulated, it's just re-regulated to favour different interest groups. So I think they're the things that we need to look at. I'm not sure the last 10 years of the political cycle would tell you that big reforms, big changes are no longer possible, but I'd like to think that if there's enough interest, if there's enough push from the outside, you almost got to muster politicians from the outside now, like we saw in the marriage equality debate. There's got to be push from the outside in order for change to happen on the inside.
And Badger, scaling this conversation up, I mean, I suppose that's why JR came, that's why he made this artwork, but also you've spoken and written about the idea of the role of the United Nations in something like this. So beyond state or federal politics, how do you imagine that could play out?
Just to try and answer it in my way, how I think. So, we've got an audience out there, but if I just use this arm, this is all into Queensland where all your rivers run. We've got native title about from here, Barkindji people down to here, Wentworth. So really where Rachel said about the fish, again, is if we don't manage the Barker properly, those little fish, what they put in about this long, they're going to die. The test is now, I come from here at Wilcannia, Menindee is here, our biggest dam is here. The fish died down here, not up in the Barker, they died there. This is what the fish killed back this year. So these little fish now, they can't swim up the river because there's a dam. They're blocking the water up here. If it don't go over this dam, Rachel and Alan live about here, and Wentworth is there, South Australia's there, Victoria's here, and this the other rivers here. So you got two lots of irrigators. There's a southern irrigator and there's a northern irrigator. And if these things are not managed, the Murray going to die was across my chest, the little fish going to die, because these little fish was here, they're going to swim down here and swim up to these rivers. So where is this management? The management got to be put, not yesterday, it's got to be here today and onward to go to what Gabriel just said about management. It's a mismanagement. We do need things to survive. We need the Barker to survive, because with the Barker, when people like Alan and Rachel and Wayne, they grow things what we can eat. We can't eat cotton. Money speaks for everything. It's just greed. We got native title. There's an opal mining town on my country called Whitecliff. We can take Whitecliff over because we outsmarted the government, but we let the white people stay. They was digging up the opal. We don't want the opal because that's Ngachi Kurna, that's the rainbow serpents dropping. We leave it alone, but we could be the richest lot of blackfellas going. But we said we will never beg to anyone. It does not matter about the later title. We will walk with the people what got nothing, but we will never beg. And the Barker is ours. And from Burke down is our country. And it's thanks to people like Alan, Rachel, and some people in the audience. We got a chef there, Stefano, what sticks with us. And we won't beg to no one. I hope that answered your question.
Of course. So, Rachel, what in terms of if the politics can change and if we can reorient, I mean, Badger talks about not being able to eat cotton, but of course there are many other opportunities for agriculture, for industry in these communities. There are other forms of fibre. There are other things to farm. What would you say about the kind of an optimistic view of the future of this these catchments as places for people, for communities?
Agriculture is really exciting to be in at the moment. It is one of the most amazing opportunities you can, but in all agriculture, no matter where you are in the world, it is underpinned by water. So if you don't have water, you don't have agriculture. And that comes down to that we have to get to putting our rivers first. And we have water sharing plans in policy, which are supposed to share, but they seem to do the opposite. And the rhetoric of those water sharing plans is that you have environmental water first, cultural water first, that sustain towns, and then your basic stock water. And then from there, you have opportunistic irrigation is sustained after that. At the moment, we seem to have policies that put opportunistic irrigation at the top of the ladder, and it's actually, as Badger said, through his arteries. If you sever the river off here, then the river below that's going to die, which is the Murray and South Australia. So if you're putting a major hole in connection within those rivers, it's detrimental to not only the ecology of it, but also all the agriculture and all the towns and all the people that all rely on it. So we have to go back to actually putting the rivers first and their base health. And that's not the basin plan's job. They're there to enhance the rivers, but the water sharing plans of each state have to underpin the base health of the river and their communities first and foremost.
Alan, as a farmer who's worked your land for decades, what do you say to other farmers further up the river in terms of, what would be your request for them to think about today?
It'd follow on very closely from what Rachel said, and from Badger for that matter. What we have is one river. It's one river system. And if anyone is going to have a future along that river in a long-term context, it doesn't matter whether it's the Aboriginal communities at Vulcania or Rachel's property or mine, you actually have to work on the basis of managing that as one river system, and you manage the river first before you start allocating water to irrigation anywhere. And I'll quite happily make that comment with a background in the irrigation game. You have to put the river first. And the reason that we've got to the mess that we are in now is that probably for the last 40 or 50 years, effectively every decision that's been made on water policy in both New South Wales and Queensland, which shouldn't just be limited to New South, they forgot about the river. And the river's a pretty tough old bird. It can tolerate a lot of things, but about 20 years ago, I think we hit the tipping point, and it's gone downhill since then. So my message to everyone along the entire river system, and this starts up near Longreach in Queensland, and it ends at the Murray Mouth down in South Australia, is that every one of us should focus on managing the river first. And then we think about what we can do. And that will mean that there'll still be plenty of cotton grown. I haven't got a problem with people growing cotton. I don't see any difference between anyone growing oranges like I did or someone growing cotton. But until we put the river first, none of us have a long-term future. And I think that's the message that I'd be trying to give to people along the river. We have a terrible problem in New South Wales at the moment where nearly all the policy, actually all the policy, assumes the Darling River finishes at Wilcannia. Now, the Murray-Darling Basin Authority did a deal with Queensland which has in, I think, a couple of minor clauses that has an obligation to get a small amount of water to Brewarrina. That's what we're dealing with now.
Okay.
We've got to start thinking about this as one whole river system. I don't actually believe it's hugely difficult to manage it as one. You've just got to have a perspective that's a little wider than what's there now. And then we'll all have a future. And it doesn't matter whether it's someone in irrigation business where we are, or whether it's Badger's community around Wilcannia, or whoever. It doesn't matter. We've got to get that river first.
Indeed. Okay. Look, we've run out of time, but I'd just like to draw people's attention to the fact that JR's work, Homily to Country, which is here at the NGV Triennial, is specifically focused on this subject, but also a broader conversation about the plight of farmers, Indigenous people internationally, and the tensions that exist between the different uses and demands that we put upon our lands. There are other works in the Triennial which explore this topic. I'd mention Glenda Nichols' work, which people will see as they arrive into the exhibition, which is the story of the mouth of the Murray River. I'd like to thank our panel today, Rachel Strawn, Badger Bates, Alan White, Gabrielle Chen. Thank you so much for joining us for this NGV Triennial conversation, and I know that your words today will reach a broad audience through this program, and I hope it stimulates the conversations that we need to have. Thank you.
Thank you.